Welcome to Film at 50, a podcast that celebrates semi-centennials in the world of cinema. I'm your host, Brian Rowe, and I'm very excited to welcome Harrison Blackman on the podcast today to talk about the 1970 drama I Never Sang for My Father, starring Melvyn Douglas and Gene Hackman in Oscar-nominated roles. How are we doing, Harrison?
Doing great. How are you?
Doing well. Excited to have you on the podcast for the first time and kind of get your take on this film released 50 years ago on October 18th, 1970. So we're just about at the date from 50 years ago. I'd like to start by asking just, about movies in general, like kind of what role have movies played in your life? And if you have two or three favorites, I'd love for you to share them with us.
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the reasons I wanted to be a writer, and I'm a writer in a lot of different fields, but I think watching movies as a kid and like thriller movies especially showed me wow, a story can be really exciting. And then when I started working in fiction, it was I want to try and replicate that kind of feeling. And I was really fascinated by books that had cinematic qualities. So Michael Crichton novels, read like screenplays. And maybe that may have been one of their shortcomings, that people complain that characters are flat or you don't have interiority, but that's because it's like a screenplay. And a lot of people do like that, and they were really popular books, right? So that was probably one of the cornerstones of getting me interested in writing. And I think movies played into that. For sure.
Okay, cool. Yeah, you mentioned Michael Crichton. I just read Jurassic Park, the novel, for the first time earlier this year since I was a teenager. And it does absolutely read kind of like a screenplay, just much longer script. You can already tell reading that book, this was going to be a movie. Because I think he co-wrote the screenplay for the film. And I'm sure as he was writing that novel, and sometimes those are the books, that are more easily kind of adapted to film too.
Yeah, and he was one of the greatest premise writers in Hollywood. He wrote and directed Westworld, which is obviously had a big impact. It was one of the first movies to have computer animation in there, so it did kind of create the technology that was used in the Terminator, stuff like that. So yeah, I think that kind of experimental thing where it would be false documents, like in Andromeda Strain, where the whole book pretends that it's a government report, but it's still like a screenplay. That kind of crossover appeal always got me into movies. So
nice. And that's a good segue to the films of the 1970s, which is kind of the focus of this podcast, at least for a long time. You just mentioned two films that Crichton directed. A lot of people don't know that he directed some films. I think he directed 7 or 8 of them. He did The Great Train Robbery with Sean Connery and Michael Caine, or Donald Sutherland, Sean Connery, but he also directed Westworld and Andromeda. The other one you talked about. I believe those came out in the early 70s. So as early as 70, 71, he was directing films. So I'll probably take a look at at least one or two of those on the podcast in the months to come. But any films of the 70s particularly stand out for you that you have seen, that you've liked in the past? Can be big films from the decade or maybe some smaller films. Anything that have kind of popped out to you before?
Well, I mean, you can't talk about the 70s without talking about The Godfather 2, right? So
just two.
Well, the first one's okay.
The first one's
right,
okay.
Right? Yeah,
but the second one.
Yeah, but I think usually when I think of this period, I think of I think
Coppola.
Well, I think of I think 67 was when Chinatown and Bonnie and Clyde come out.
Bonnie and Clyde is 67. Chinatown is later. That's 74.
Oh, okay, because that was they lost to the Godfather movies, right?
Yeah, Godfather 2 was 74. So Chinatown, it might have won a couple things. I can't remember, but yeah, it lost picture and director to Godfather 2. Yeah, which I love. Francis Ford Coppola, he was nominated for Best Director for The Godfather 1, didn't win. And then 2 years later, he won for the sequel, which I thought was funny. Yeah, this is a really important decade for cinema. It's one of those interesting decades since the beginning of this medium. And so, as I've said on the podcast before, it's kind of the real excitement for me for these next few years is to really dig into these years of the 70s in cinema and find some gems I might never have seen before, that I never would have seen if I didn't have this podcast. So the film we're actually talking about today is one I'd never seen before, and one that I might never have seen unless I was doing like a deep dive into Gene Hackman's career. I think today's film is an example of something that's like why like why I'm doing this, and wanting to give our listeners some ideas of really great films that came out around this time 50 years ago. And so that brings us to our film today, which is I Never Sang for My Father, starring Melvyn Douglas and Gene Hackman. I'm going to start by just giving a general plot summary of the movie, what it's about, and then I'll move into some background info with some trivia. And if you have anything for either of those segments, feel free to chime in. So this film tells the story of Gene. This is one of those movies where the actor's name is the same name as the actor in the movie. So when I'm saying Gene, you might not ever know what I'm talking about.
It's so convenient. I
Yeah.
really appreciated like, oh man, that's Gene. And when they show Gene Hackman, like his character has written a book and he's like a novelist or
Yeah.
something. And it's like, it's Gene.
Yeah,
So,
because he went on to write, I don't know if he's written more than one. He wrote like a Western novel in the last 10 years, right? Like he retired in 2004 from film acting. And then I'd say in the last 10 years, he like published a novel. So it's coming true.
yeah.
So he plays Gene, a professor and a writer who's always lived close to his mother and father in New York City. But he's in a serious relationship with a woman named Peggy who lives in California. And so he's thinking of moving out there and basically staying there for the first time in his life. Gene Hackman filmed this movie. He was like 38, 39 years old. So that's something we'll talk about too. Like he's like 39 and the parents are still relying on him to stay close by. It's like, okay. But Gene's father, Tom, played by Melvyn Douglas, he of course makes him feel guilty for wanting to leave. He even tells him that his moving to California would kill his mother. Margaret, played by Dorothy Stickney. Well, actually, she's on board with the idea, right? She's okay with him leaving. It's the dad who has a problem with it, and she thinks it's his father that doesn't like the idea of him moving, but wants to just pretend it's the mother's problem. And then what happens? She suffers a heart attack and she dies, but he hasn't moved yet, so he can't blame himself too much. And now Gene feels it might be in his best interest to stick around New York a while longer and take care of his father. He feels that might be the right thing to do. He's kind of trying to figure it out. But his sister Alice shows up, played by Estelle Parsons, making this film a really unique Bonnie and Clyde reunion. They played husband and wife in Bonnie and Clyde 3 years prior. And in this film, they play brother and sister. She comes into town from Chicago for the funeral of their mother, and she begs her brother to go live his life, not surrender under the wants of their father. That's kind of her role in this movie. It's like, tell him, don't do this to yourself. Like, go live your life. So he agrees with her to an extent, but he also isn't sure if he wants to just have his father waste away in a retirement home. He might feel kind of guilty about that. So he comes up with a solution that may or may not work. And by the end of the film, he and his father come to blows over both their futures. It's kind of the general summary. Trying not to give away the ending of any movie on the podcast. So anything else you want to add to that? Although we have to talk about the end a little bit, like at least in vague terms, like how this movie ends.
Because I think even your summary of the premise covers about 80 minutes of the 90 minutes of the movie. So.
Oh yeah, yeah. Did I give away too much? Probably.
Well, I don't think this is a movie that there's no Kaiser Soze reveal.
Yeah. There's not a twist ending. Yeah. It doesn't turn into, it's not, Mulholland Drive in the last 40 minutes.
Yeah.
So there's nothing in this film that the listeners will be like, oh my gosh, how dare you giving away this, any of the second half. I mean, it kind of goes in directions you expect. There's no like huge twist. I'd say the biggest surprise is the death of the mother. And that's what, 25 minutes into the movie. It happens pretty early, so.
Right. It is like, an inciting incident that is a little late, but in terms of if this was based on a play, right?
So based on a play. Yep.
Act structure,
which has been a running theme on this podcast. I feel like we've talked about like 3 films based on plays. That seemed to be a big deal in 1970. Like if there was a play that was even semi-popular in 68, 69, it would become a film. Was kind of a thing. All right, so let's talk about some background info. So as you say, this was based on a play. It was on Broadway. It was the same title as the film, and that opened in January of 1968, and it ran for about 124 performances. The writer of the play, Robert Anderson, also wrote the screenplay for the movie, and he received an Oscar nomination for his script. The director is Gilbert Cates, who I had to look up. I did not recognize who that was. He had a long career as both a director and a producer in the film industry for more than 40 years. And I scrolled through all of his credits. I had not heard of a single film he had directed. like through the 70s, through the 80s, I'm like, some of these movies went to theaters and like had a couple known people, and I could not recognize a single title, which is kind of unique, like for someone to make movies for 20 plus years, and I can't I can't pin down one of those movies. A lot of smaller films, right? Like films like I Never Sang for My Father. He didn't make like a Arnold Schwarzenegger action flick in the 80s or anything. He didn't. Some directors, they like start small and then they go like into like big genre films, but he never did that apparently.
Right. Well, so it sounds like he was very professional and
mm-hmm.
Maybe didn't have the breakout, and maybe Marvel Studios wasn't around to hire
Marvel
him
wasn't around
to do like Ant-Man 4. Yeah.
But yeah, like recently on the podcast, we talked about a director who he made. We talked about Monty Walsh, which was the director's first film, and then he would go on to make 2 more movies as director, and then he never directed another movie after that. So sometimes these directors, if they don't have a hit after a few movies, they go do something else. But Gilbert Cates is someone who just kept making films for many years.
Something, right? If you last that long,
so I guess
something must be working.
Yeah. I'm gonna look into more of his films and see. I'm sure he has some gems in there. But he's actually most famous as a producer of the Academy Awards. He produced the ceremonies for 14 times between 1990 and 2008, and that's how I knew his name. I'm like, I've heard that name, Gilbert Cates. That sounds familiar. What I can't. Is it because of a film he's directed? It's because I recognize his name I started watching the Academy Awards when I was a kid in like 92, 93. And I've watched them every year since, and I just think I've heard that name. And he actually won an Emmy for one of the telecasts, so that's something he was doing a lot. So it's like kind of interesting. Cool. Like he was directing films for many years, and then he kind of in the 90s he had a couple more credits, but not very many left. And so he kind of transitioned into this new role as producing the Academy Awards ceremonies. Probably pissed off that they never nominated him. Like, well, I'm going to run the show. He was also
sounds like a difficult job. Yeah.
Yeah. He was also dean of UCLA's School of Theater, Film, and Television from 1991 to 1998. So it looked like he went into more like education and behind the scenes of like award ceremonies, things like that, and wasn't involved as much in making fictional films and things like that. So Edward G. Robinson was the original choice for Tom.
Oh,
and,
wow.
Like classic film actor, which would have been interesting. I don't know how much longer he had in his career at that point. And the playwright and screenwriter Robert Anderson wanted an actor named Richard Widmark for the role of Gene, but he had to settle for Gene Hackman. I think it all worked out okay. This was the final feature film credit for Dorothy Stickney, who played Gene's mother, Margaret. She would live on into. I was like, did she die soon after this or something? Because that would be kind of eerie, right? With what happens with her character in the movie. She didn't die until 1998. She just retired. But this was her final film role. It's kind of interesting. Kind of an interesting way to go out, like to play like your final movie. You play a character who dies suddenly at the beginning. The film received 2 other Oscar nominations: Best Leading Actor for Melvyn Douglas, who plays Tom the dad, and Best Supporting Actor for Gene Hackman, which I found, I was kind of like asking myself, is Gene Hackman playing the supporting role in this movie?
Isn't he the lead? Yeah.
He was the lead. And this is something that goes back decade after decade, where they get nominated for the wrong category, and sometimes they win, right? And sometimes it's hard to judge. They're kind of like in between, but when the movie is about Gene Hackman's character, like he's kind of our point of view character in the movie, kind of an interesting choice. I feel like it should have been swapped. I feel like Hackman should have been lead actor and Douglas should have been supporting. And I feel like if Douglas had gone supporting, maybe he could have won the award. But does he have enough screen time to warrant leading actor? That's a little questionable. What do you think?
Well, it's like Douglas is this old Hollywood guy. He was in
Hmm.
those big movies with like Greta Garbo and
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah. He
Wilder
goes back.
movies.
Career goes back many, many years, so that
Yeah, so
sometimes plays a role.
it has to deal with that,
Hmm.
and like they're honoring. It's kind of like rolling out Kirk Douglas, before he passed, and giving him the honorary Oscar kind of
Okay,
thing.
yeah.
Yeah,
Well, I always go back to Anthony Hopkins won Best Leading Actor for Silence of the Lambs, and I believe he's in 20 to 25 minutes of the whole movie,
I give
but
it
he
to
got
him.
leading
It's
actor.
okay. Yeah.
So sometimes it's like sometimes it's not just about minutes on screen. Sometimes it's about kind of the history of the actor. Does he have a really great body of work, and we want to kind of recognize him as kind of this bigger force in the movie, even if the screen time isn't there. And I mean, he's in a lot of the film. It's not something that I would be yelling at any Academy members for doing, but I just thought that was kind of an interesting pairing of categories there for those two actors. So let's see. So Melvyn Douglas lost the Oscar, but and this was news to me. He won the other two times he was nominated at the Academy Awards. He won first time for the movie HUD starring Paul Newman, and the second time for the movie Being There, starring Peter Sellers. So for those two films, he won Best Supporting Actor. So he has two Oscars on the shelf or wherever. I mean, obviously he's passed on. Maybe one of his kids. I don't know. And then Gene Hackman also lost the Oscar, but he has also won two Oscars in his career. He won the next year for Best Leading Actor for The French Connection. That would be coming just a few months after this movie. And he also won Best Supporting Actor for Unforgiven, the Clint Eastwood film from the early 90s. He was also nominated for Oscars for Bonnie and Clyde and Mississippi Burning. And his last major award win was the Golden Globe for Best Actor in a Comedy for The Royal Tenenbaums in 2002, 2 years before his retirement. That's all I got for background info. Anything else you have to add?
Well, I think this is an interesting moment in Gene Hackman's career, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if his breakout is the Bonnie and Clyde role, which he's not the main character of that, but
Yeah. Have you
this
seen
is,
Bonnie and Clyde?
yeah,
Okay. Yeah,
it's been a while.
that was kind of his, yeah, you're right. His kind of semi breakthrough was Bonnie and Clyde, although he's not obviously the lead of that film. He's in what, maybe a third of it, maybe a little bit more than the third. Um, you know, makes a striking impression in that movie, as well as Estelle Parsons, who plays his wife in that. So that was kind of like his first kind of like push, right? Like the
Yeah,
first movie that got him noticed, that got him an Oscar nomination. Anytime you're a young actor, up and coming actor, and you get an Oscar nomination, that's always going to help your career at least a little bit. And it definitely helped him. He would go on to be, I believe it was 4, maybe even 5 films in 1971. So by 1970, he's firmly like established, like, and directors want to use him.
yeah,
And
like the French
and
Connection
then the
is
French
great.
Connection by William Friedkin would come out in the fall of 1971. And that was a huge hit, super influential movie, won Best Picture, Best Director of the Year at the Oscars, and it won Hackman Best Leading Actor in a Movie, the Oscar for that. So after French Connection, he was off and running, and he was an established star. So in some ways, it's almost like this film is one of the last before he's a really major star and actor in Hollywood. I would say I Never Sang for My Father is kind of like one of the last ones he did before he really became established. So what did you think of the movie overall? What was your kind of take on this film? I'm assuming you hadn't seen it before.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it was interesting. I think there there aren't so many films made in this. I would call it the King Lear genre.
Okay.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, because that's basically the type of movie this is, where you have an aging parent and the child that is not quite reconciled with them.
Hmm.
And I think that is occasionally every once in a while there's a big movie that addresses these themes of aging
Hmm.
and coming to terms with parents after some difficulty. So like, yeah, I think this movie really reminded me of like Tokyo Story
Okay.
by Ozu, because in that film there is this character Noriko she's basically like Gene Hackman, and she also has a dead spouse, and
Hmm.
is taking care of her parents and has all these burdens and conflicted feelings and
Hmm.
the same kind of conflict. So
Yeah.
And I don't think, most people when they go to the movies, they don't want to acknowledge or think about this kind of subject because it is something that happens to everyone. Uh, so maybe that's why these movies aren't made as often.
Yeah, it's not subject matter that we necessarily want to go see. we get in our car and drive to the theater and get our popcorn. We don't want to watch a movie about about this subject too often. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, but what's like? What did you like about the movie? Anything you didn't like? Just in general, like what kind of worked for you?
Um, I would say that this is peak airports without people in them, and
Yeah,
peak wallpaper.
yeah,
uh,
yeah. Hmm.
like the set design is pretty interesting.
Yeah, production
The,
design. Yeah,
the the camera is pretty restrained most of the time,
yeah, except
but
for a
there,
couple places
yeah,
which we can talk about.
yeah. I don't know when you want to talk about that, but I'm interested in talking about those moments when the camera starts doing interesting things.
Yeah, we can talk about that when I have a question about the director and kind of like his technical approach to the movie, so we can get to that in a few minutes.
Yeah,
But yeah, but just overall, did you like the film? Did it work for you?
yeah. I think it works. Um, I think there's a lot of complex psychology in this movie.
Hmm.
All the characters have a lot going on, and there's a lot of backstories intersecting in ways that are really interesting, especially for this movie's really tight. It's 92 minutes.
Yeah.
That's pretty impressive.
Hmm.
I think Gene Hackman, a lot of times in his later roles, he's kind of either playing like uh, an authority figure that's
Hmm.
really
Oh yeah.
aggressive,
Hmm. Many of his
or
later films, yeah.
or a parody of an authority figure who's very aggressive. And here, we see this other side of him that you see in some of his earlier work too. And I think that really shines through and helps establish him.
Yeah, Gene Hackman, in his like the 90s and 2000s, so many of his roles, you're right, are kind of like the authority figure, the villain, the one with all the power. I feel like that might have started with Superman when he played Lex
Yeah.
Luthor in the late 70s. But here we have him much more reserved, right? We have a couple of kind of explosive outbursts from him in like the second half of the movie, but especially in the first half, he's very just kind of quiet and still trying to kind of find himself and what he wants to do with his life. And I found that to be kind of an interesting, new side of Hackman I don't usually see in movies. And yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, from a technical standpoint, this film wasn't anything remarkable. But I found the story really relatable and resonant. Like the story of a father and son having issues is something that I can easily identify with. And I'm always kind of compelled by stories like that when they're done tastefully and they're done with this kind of humor and seriousness and kind of a unique take on the subject matter with such a great cast. I mean, there's not a bad apple in the bunch in this movie. I mean, it's mostly just the two men. But Estelle Parsons, who I mentioned before, I think is outstanding in this film in her brief role as the sister. So yeah, I found it really compelling all the way through, while at the same time recognizing while I'm watching it, like there's nothing really extraordinary about the technical side of this, the cinematography and the production design. And something that would take me out occasionally in this movie was the music. Did you
Yeah.
notice like how the music would three times I wrote in my notebook, I'm like, am I watching a horror film? Like starting with the opening shot where it like zooms in on the picture of them and the music's like really kind of like low and uneasy, and you're like, I mean, if this movie was starting and I had no idea what was happening, I'd read up on it a little bit before I started. So I was like, is this a horror film? Like, what's happening here? And then that would go away and the music would change, and then there'd be 30 minutes, 40 minutes, and everything, it feels like a drama about a family. And then there would be like another scene where the music is like getting like horrific again. I'm thinking specifically of the scene where he's walking through the retirement home, which
Yeah.
we'll get to. But before we get to the technical side of it, like what do you think the theme of the movie is? What do you think the movie's kind of trying to say to the viewers? What's like the theme of the film?
Well, I think so. The movie has an intro and outro that
Hmm.
are, I think, the same, right?
Was
And
it the same? Yeah, yeah. I felt like the outro at the end was a little bit longer, but
yeah,
it does
they
feel, it is kind of a similar feeling. Yeah.
it's like they. I think that is like them really showing you and telling you what the theme is, really abstrusely, because he's saying like death. What was it? Death may end a life, but it doesn't end a relationship. And but the kind of like even
Yeah, yeah.
though my
Hmm.
father's gone, I still haven't quite got there in terms of like I never really we were never on the same page. And it's like this conflict is like Gene Hackman's character reflecting on the past, and this stuff has lived with him, and there's no escaping it,
Hmm.
which is, I think very realistic in terms of contending with aging parents. Some of them might be stubborn in how to handle all of that, especially in modern times when people live so far away from each other.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes I don't like that when a movie ends and it goes to the voiceover. Let me tell you what this film was about for the next 30 seconds before
That's like
credits roll. But I don't know.
Spider-Man.
This
Yeah.
one it kind of worked because it is kind of like repeating what we get at the very beginning with the black and white photograph and the zooming in, zooming out. It kind of like it felt right in this one. I feel like another movie I might have been like rolling my eyes like what? Because usually I don't like anything explained to me at the end. Like I want to sit with it and think about what the movie was trying to say. Whereas this one spells out a little bit more, but I think that's okay. And yeah, I mean, I think the movie's a lot about just like the ability, trying to find the ability to love somebody while at the same time not always able to communicate that love is like a big
Yeah.
part, especially with the son and the father. It's not like they're avoiding each other in this movie. They have lots of scenes where they're talking, and sometimes it's about something, sometimes it's not. And then when we get to like the explosive kind of final scene, the final kind of confrontation of them together at the end, like it's like they're both trying to find common ground with each other, but they never this can never find it, and it's frustrating and it's sad. But it's like the way real life is with many, especially many fathers and sons. So yeah. All right, so let's talk about the director and the technical aspects of the movie. You mentioned, a couple scenes, like two that came to mind immediately about, using handheld and kind of doing something a little bit more cinematic than a lot of the scenes in this movie where the camera is just locked on sticks and letting the actors and the story be the star. Gilbert Cates really does kind of stay away. He kind of like his presence is not a part of the movie. Like some directors like to put in their flourishes, their visual flourishes, and make their mark on every movie that they're in. Where you can put on 10 minutes of any of their films and be like, oh, that's a Wes Anderson movie or that's a David Fincher movie. Gilbert Cates definitely stays out of it 90+% percent of the time. Like, but what are the touches he did in this movie that you thought were kind of interesting?
Well, I think when you have a camera that is so restrained
Mm-hmm.
for most of the runtime, that the moments in which you break from that are significant. So I did notice when Gene Hackman, or Gene, his character,
Gene.
when he picks up the phone and he finds out that his mom has passed away, there
Mm-hmm.
is a very strong like zoom on.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And then there's that scene in the assisted living facility, which is shot like a horror nightmare sequence
With the music, like
with music.
coming.
The camera is shaky. The
Yeah.
music, and it's almost like it feels like there's strobe lights, but I don't know.
Yeah, it almost goes a little too far. Like, I mean, not only is the camera like
Yeah.
really like panning around and zooming in on all these older people who just are so sad, it's so depressing, but then he'll like do like a montage cut of like people we've already seen before and then back to Gene. He's like it felt it was like
It's over the top.
it's a
Yeah.
little much considering how almost every other scene in the movie is really laid back in terms of its visual style. It seemed to be, and I like a good idea that maybe he took a little too far in the editing room, and then, they had to
Right. It's not
block
like
picture.
the scene when Jodie Foster is walking into the asylum and meeting Hannibal for the first time. It's like, this is an assisted living facility. These
Yeah,
people are not like convicted criminals. Like, what is going on? So,
yeah.
yeah,
And even in Silence of the Lambs, the director Jonathan Demme,
yeah.
he's pretty restrained when she's walking down to see Hannibal for the first time. I mean, yeah, he could have really like played that up and have like montage cutting and seeing like some of the other prisoners 5 times and her eyes going like that, like that would have put people off of that movie, but it's that kind of like restrained way. So yeah, no, it's always interesting to me, especially looking at this time period where, you know, filmmakers are taking more chances with visual styles in the early 70s, to see kind of like a basic kind of drama like this, where it's for the most part, you know, visually, it's, you know, it's in many ways like you're watching a play for most of the movie. And then to see him do that for one scene towards the end of the movie, it definitely it hits you like like you've noticed it. It's not like oh okay, this is just another scene. There was one other moment at the beginning where he's like just walking around his parents' house, and the camera, and in one take, one shot, the camera follows him throughout, and there's like a ballad playing, like it's not just score, it's like somebody singing a song as he walks around the house. I was kind of wondering why, like what that was about. Did you notice that scene at all? It was towards the beginning.
Right. Maybe that washed over me a little. Still getting used to the pacing, but yeah, I think maybe that goes with the title and how he had been in the choir when he was
Oh yeah,
a boy.
that's a good idea.
But also,
Yeah,
if we're going to talk about the title,
yeah. Let's talk about the title.
I think it's not a very good title.
For considering how, like, I mean, we finally learned at the end why it's called that, right? So we learned that there was a
Yeah,
song that Gene's mother used to play on the piano when Gene was a kid that his father really loved, but Gene, I guess, was he did sing a little bit. Gene did, but he wouldn't sing that song. Isn't that kind of what the
yeah,
title's referring to?
yeah,
So like it's not one of those titles that makes zero sense where you're just like okay, but I think it's an awkward enough title that it should have a real clear point, like a real
yeah,
clear, you know, like there should be something at the end that really like makes you well up with tears, or where there's like planting and payoff, where maybe, you know, maybe Gene wanted to record this song, and it's kind of like some sort of a storyline that kind of goes through the whole movie. Like, is it ever really mentioned until that last scene, like about the song his dad wanted him to sing? It comes right at the end in the last 15 minutes. It's I don't think it's referred to before that. So I feel like if you're going to call the movie that,
yeah,
it should be something that's planted even in the first 5 minutes, and then maybe a scene where, you know, he takes out some old lyrics or something halfway through and he sings a verse, or like just like something to where it's kind of building to that moment and have it be like really important to the story. But I feel like you could have cut that mention of it and the story wouldn't have changed that much. So
yeah. I think it does. It's a full sentence. You have a pronoun, you have a verb, and you have subject, object, everything. So
you wanted it to just be called Gene.
right. Well, I think
Dad
maybe
and me.
this sounds like a play title.
Yeah.
Like you can't take it with you. You know, you can have sentence titles for
Mm-hmm.
plays, right? And you know, it's the same screenwriter as the playwright.
Yeah.
So maybe he was like, well, I have to advertise it based on the success of the play.
Yeah, that's true. It might have come up because film titles usually aren't super long in the long history of movies. Usually you want a shorter title. So that might have come up, and it might have been a case where like, well, people know the play, and so we have to keep it keep it. But I'm just like trying to imagine like people going to the theater to see the movie opening weekend. Hi, two for I never sang for my father.
It's too many words. You know, it's kind of like if you see like a blockbuster, or like you say when you see a Fast and Furious movie, you don't say I am seeing Fast and Furious 10 or whatever. You say
Yeah.
Fast and Furious, and then they
Yeah.
give you the ticket. So
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people said I'm here to see Too Fast, Too Furious. I think they said one for Fast and Furious, but you know.
yeah,
I like that we in like the same breath we talked about I never sang for my father and the Fast and the Furious franchise. I
well,
would
that's
love
what
to
happened.
see
Yeah,
that version of I never sang for my father. Vin Diesel.
I think it's coming, and you know, once we get to 20.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah,
the 20th Fast and Furious when when Vin Diesel can play the dad, Tom. Yeah. Okay. And then performances. So we've talked about a couple on the podcast so far of 1970 films that got Oscar nominations for acting. This is another one. We touched on it earlier when I was talking about background info. But why do you think these two performances stood out? Why do you think they got recognized by the Academy? Anything about their performances specifically that you thought was really strong or unique?
well, I think Gene Hackman. We can talk about him first because he's more clearly like he's the character that has all the conflict and the complex psychology. His character has a lot going on, right? His spouse has passed away.
Yeah, we haven't talked about that yet. I forgot to mention that in the plot summary. So he had a spouse, a wife who passed away. Do we learn why she passed away? Did she have an illness or did she was in an accident? I don't know if the movie ever tells you.
I think it's implied that there was an accident.
Okay, an accident.
Or I thought it was like an illness. I mean.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, I was thinking maybe she had an illness of some kind because it sounds like it wasn't just like a sudden death. It sounded like it was kind of, it was happening. Her illness might have been happening for a long, long time, maybe more than 6 months, because he's still in grief about it, and it's been at least a couple years, right, if not longer.
Yeah. So he's grieving his late wife. He has a new fiance in California.
Yep.
Who is a gynecologist and sounds pretty successful
and very blonde and very, very blonde.
She is very blonde.
We actually get to meet her. I was happy about that. I thought we would never see that character.
Yeah, and then he's also got a mistress,
and he's also sleeping around.
Yeah,
which I'm like, what? Okay,
which the movie doesn't really pass judgment on or evaluate. It's just like, yeah, well, you're still so supposed to root for him, so whatever. And you're like, there's no conflict there. Because his mistress is like some art teacher in town, and she has all these pastel paintings and busts of like Greek philosophers in her room. So
yeah, and she just gets one scene, right? Is she in more than one scene of the movie? Is she in two? I feel like it's just that one scene early on.
Right. Most of the movie is Gene Hackman bouncing off of different
women
supporting
and his dad.
actresses. Yeah. So his sister, his fiance, his mom, his mistress.
These are not all the same people, just to be
they're
not all the same person, just to be clear about that.
And then his sister, she's kind of been cast out from the family because she married.
Yeah, she kind of just took off, right? She was not gonna be her brother and stick around and be close to the parents. She moved to Chicago, got married, has a family, and she's just kind of had her own life outside of the rest of her family. She maybe calls and stuff, but I don't think. I think the parents have kind of resigned themselves to like, okay, she's gone, but we have our son.
Right, but there was something about, I think in the plot summary, I had to check on this, but that she was basically exiled from the family because she married a Jewish man.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
So there's
so it wasn't all her
anti-Semitic thing going on too.
Okay. Yeah. So they're not the most like open-minded parents.
It doesn't sound.
Oh, you're gonna marry him. Okay, bye.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Gene Hackman, as I said before, the next year he would go on to really be an established star, and a lot of his performances later on he would play really tough guys, right?
Yeah.
Or know-it-alls, or like the kind of like reserved is not something I think when I think Gene Hackman. So that's what I really responded to in this movie, was to see him play kind of not a loser, but kind of just like he can't move on, he can't like
he's frustrated,
but there's that moment where he's got to talk with his sister, and she's like, you need to stand up to him and tell him you are going to get married and move to California. That's what you're gonna do. And then the next scene, he's kind of like staying quiet, and he's like, oh, Dad, I can move in here with you, Dad, just for a month, maybe a little longer, and she and the sister's just going, are you serious? So that kind of kind of character is not one you often see Gene Hackman play, and that was like a nice, it obviously wasn't in 1970 when people were seeing this movie. People, not a lot of people probably knew who he was, or just maybe knew him from Bonnie and Clyde. So but especially looking back now 50 years later, this is a unique character for him.
Yeah. And then I think when we're talking about Melvyn Douglas, his character does have a lot of plot threads and backstory that you wouldn't expect in a movie of this brief.
Oh yeah.
And I don't. Melvyn Douglas is not someone I'm super familiar with. I haven't seen a lot of that era's movies. But I at some points I felt maybe this was a problem with the script, but he does seem like a caricature of an old person.
Okay. Yeah.
Maybe overridden in terms of like, I am senile, I'm gonna be grumpy, and you're like, okay, I get it. Why do you have to say it?
Yeah,
So
it's yeah, that is a tough character to love. Like he, like
yeah,
there are moments where he opens up, like he tells a story about his wife when they first met, and that's like it kind of humanizes him a little bit. But geez, even by the end, he's like still just in the same old ways, and he just like can't connect to his son. He can't just be loving towards his son, and it's just it's a frustrating experience for the viewer because you can see it in him. Like there is obviously affection there for his
yeah,
son, and he just can't show it in a way that that his son can give it back. And yeah, no, I picked up on that a little bit. There were a couple moments where it almost seemed overwritten and too much of a caricature, but I found Melvyn Douglas just be extremely believable as this guy. Like I not having as same with you, I'm not that familiar with his career. As you say, Greta Garbo, he probably goes back to the 30s, maybe even before that.
yeah.
But he's so believable as this guy, and because I'm not super familiar with him, as a physical presence in movies, like I could really just from the first scene he was in, I could really just buy into him as this character.
Yeah, and like it was interesting because it seems like the way the script is written, it's showing that he's overprotective of Gene because his father walked out on him,
Mm-hmm.
and his mother, and they have that story about
Yeah.
his mother's funeral and the father showing up and him chasing him away.
And he talks. What does he mention it 5 or 6 times in the movie that he had
Yeah,
he had a horrible childhood.
it's
When I was 8 years old, I was on my own.
it's overplayed a little bit, but maybe that's kind of what I think sometimes when people get older, they rely on a
Mm-hmm.
few key moments in their life
Yeah.
to justify their life's trajectory. And so I think that is something that is sort of real, but maybe could have been toned down.
Yeah, and it's so believable too that he is just completely against this idea. I don't need a live-in housekeeper. I don't need to go to a home. I'm fine. Gene, if you want to go, go. I'll be fine. But even when he's saying it, you can kind of tell like he doesn't want Gene to leave. He wants Gene to stay. I think at one point he's like, "Well, Gene will come and visit me, once, maybe twice a week." Like he doesn't want to be alone. But he
Yeah.
tells them he's okay, and that's very believable. I know there's so many people at his age who would say the same thing. I'm fine. I don't need help. But sometimes they do.
But in that, oh,
Yeah, you go ahead.
well, I was going to say, like, there was also that moment in the final confrontation
Mm,
sequence in which he talks about uh, this woman that he was interested in
mm-hmm.
romantically as a young man.
Yeah.
And like that story is also very interesting and adds more layers to this character.
Yeah, it's through his monologues that I actually didn't look up to see if this was based on a play before I watched it.
Mhm.
But I could tell through by the time he was doing a second monologue, I was like, oh, this is based on a play, because you don't really see that. You don't see that in very many films. I mean,
Yeah.
I guess The Godfather opens up with like a 5-minute monologue. I mean, there are films not based on plays that have them.
Yeah.
But in a film of like this kind of small scope and this few of characters, I think it's pretty clear, especially when he's talking and he goes often into these stories that I for the most part humanize him, but just not quite enough before he reverts back to the person he is. Any other actors in the film that stood out to you?
Well, I think Estelle Parsons stands out.
Yeah.
Uh, for like she's playing this character that is the antithesis to Gene's indecision, right? So I think
Mm-hmm.
that structural dynamic works really well, and she plays that part well. And I think Dorothy Pinkney, that's her name.
Yeah,
The
Dorothy Dorothy Stickney.
Stickney. Okay, I was close. But yeah, I thought she played. They all felt like they were related. I could buy that this was a family unit.
Yeah. Even I noticed Estelle Parsons kind of looked like she could be the
Yeah,
daughter of the mother. Like they kind of had some physical similarities. I always like that. It does bother me in a film when the kids look nothing like the parents at all, and you're like, you kind of go with it. You're like, especially
Yeah.
when there's like two brothers and they don't look anything alike and they don't look like the parents, and you're like, okay. Like, it's not very believable. If the movie is strong enough, you get past it. But I always admire, when the casting director or whoever, put the actors in the film, when there is at least some sort of resemblance, like, if not the face, like the hair and stuff. But yeah, I thought the female actors in this film did really well. Obviously, Estelle Parsons is a standout, at least for me. I'm not super familiar with her career either. I know her well from Bonnie and Clyde, which earned her an Oscar for Best Supporting Actress, and the show Roseanne. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's about what I know her from. So I know her as like the shrieky, like like crazy mom or wife kind of character. And again, really great to see her be reserved in this movie, to see a different side of that actress I had never seen before. Yeah, I actually was surprised she didn't get any recognition for the film. I mean, even though she's only in a small part of it, I think I thought she did really well. And it was a unique kind of, to kind of see it flipped in this movie, especially for 1970, to see kind of the woman, the sister, kind of in charge, and like the one who has a little bit more confidence in herself, to like say to the brother, who I don't know if he's older, supposed to be older than her in the movie, but to say to the brother, like, look, you need to get your act together here. Usually you'd see that flipped, right? The man would come in and say, like, sister, you need to get, you need to figure this out. And to see that, the kind of the gender dynamic flip there in this film, I thought was really intriguing. And just to see her play a real like person who's not screaming and yelling in every scene and trying to go for laughs like she does on some of her later television work. It was kind of a nice change of pace. I enjoyed watching that. And yeah, I thought everyone else was really good in the movie. I don't know all the other names off the top of my head, but there wasn't, what how many people in this film? 6 or 7, not too many, but yeah, there wasn't a bad apple in the bunch. Sometimes you get an actor to come in for a scene and you're like,
Right. Like even the guy who's like a member of the Rotary Club.
yeah.
So when they go to the Rotary meeting while, the mom is dying,
Yeah.
because he's like, let's just go to the Rotary. She'd want us to go, Melvyn says. And then they go and then they talk to this one guy, and the one guy's like, your father is a remarkable man. Excuse me, but I have to leave now, right? It's like, okay, this is definitely maybe not the party that the father was looking for.
Yeah. So any other favorite scenes from the movie? One we haven't talked about that I really loved was the casket scene, which lasts 4 or 5 minutes. It's a long scene. And the dad, Tom, does most of the talking, and Gene says almost nothing, and I think until the end. And it's just like it keeps going and going, and he goes from one casket to the next, and he's every single casket he's like, $2,000. What's it made of? And then 500. Oh, this one could work. She won't know the difference. and then he keeps going. Oh, here's one that's 800. Why are they and it just keeps going. And I was like, it was like a kind of a curious scene. It kind of brought to mind 6 Feet Under a little bit, one of my favorite TV shows. This to really just like get in, like the movie does not really show the funeral at all, or anything. It shows the scene before where they're picking out a casket. So any idea why do you think why this, like, the playwright and screenwriter chose to kind of focus on that part of the grieving process and the funeral process, and not actually give us like a long funeral scene? Any idea why?
Well, we see funeral scenes all the time.
Exactly.
and I think this is like one of the most Kafka-esque like problems that you could have, that anyone has at some point in their lives, where it's like, okay, it's like buying a car, but you won't really notice what car you're driving after a certain point. So it's like, are you going to be cheap?
Yeah.
Are you going to buy the luxury brand? Like, it's like this indictment of like commercialism, but like, you do have to buy it, but what should you buy? What is the morally right thing to buy? And this, of course, Tom, he's stubborn, and like, he's playing like, I can't pay that much for this. And it's just this pernicious aspect of aging that is like, I think that particular moment everyone's going to have to go through, and it is this weird thing.
And then Gene is just kind of shuffling along behind him, just kind of keeping his head down and just pick whatever, Dad.
He's like, I don't think it matters at some point, right?
I thought that was, I mean, you know, most of the film is pretty serious, right? There was like a little bit of black humor aspect of that scene just because of how long it is, and him pointing out every single price of each casket. And you know, the guy's like really selling them, like, oh, you should go with that. Oh, this one's very nice, made of silk. You know? And Gene's just kind of standing there like, get me out of here. So I
Or when
thought that
Tom's
was
like,
really...
our plot is on a hill and it could erode. And
Oh, right. Like we're on like a hit. Like we're like, how does that work with us? Like we're on the side of a hill, and he's like, oh, it should be fine. We'll figure it out. Right.
oh boy,
So I like that
okay.
scene a lot. Any other
Yeah.
scenes in the film that stood out to you besides the ones we've talked about? I'm trying to think. Those were kind of like the big ones. Oh, I did have like a COVID flash when he walks into the hospital room to see his mom, who has had a heart attack. She hasn't
Yeah,
died yet, and
and
she
she's in a
has like
bubble.
she has like the bubble around her, and I'm like, is this COVID?
I was like, I got my face mask ready. I'm ready, man.
So is that something they did in 1970? Like you had a heart attack, you had to be in a bubble?
Well, maybe I think this movie does indulge in strange horror
Like,
elements, right? Musical
like,
decisions, the assisted living facility. I think it adds to the horror that she's
uh-huh.
surrounded in plastic.
Yeah.
Uh,
But she doesn't have a disease, so why is she wrapped up?
yeah, is it her heart? Do they say? I
Yeah,
don't
she's
remember.
yeah. He says he calls doesn't he call Peggy in California, and he says I can't come out for a little bit. My mom just had a heart attack. So he says
Yeah,
heart
okay.
attack. So I don't know if she had another disease that they left on the cutting room floor. But I'm like, why is she in this like giant bubble in the in bed? And she's just kind of sitting there calmly, like, oh, I'm okay. And then 5 minutes later, she's dead. Like, okay. Geez, poor mom. I did feel like it was kind of weird that the dad actually says to him, if you go to California, that will kill your mother. And then 7 minutes later, or whatever it is, she's dead. I thought that was a weird,
I
like,
think he's onto something.
like, you know, I'm just like, I'm glad that Gene didn't move to California in those 7 minutes, because then he'd really feel bad. Like if he had just like, it's like his first night with his fiance in California, and he gets the call, then he'd really
Yeah.
feel guilty.
Well, I have another nitpick because at the beginning of the movie, which Gene Hackman picks them up from the airport because they're
Yeah.
just on vacation.
Oh, right. Yeah. I forgot about that. Yeah. It's
And so she's well enough to do that.
Yep.
But at first, I thought Gene Hackman had arrived from like he was visiting the parents, and so I mean, it's clear that they're coming off the plane and stuff. But it was kind of like who's visiting who at the beginning.
Yeah. And isn't there a moment in the movie where a doctor, someone says, well, she was living on borrowed time? Isn't that line like after he learns of her death, like a doctor's like, well, you know, it was coming, kind of this idea. So if that's true, then why were they on vacation, just to get one more trip in before her death? I don't know.
Yeah, I know they're in New York somewhere.
Yeah.
But it did feel kind of vague, intentionally vague as to where they were. They were on the East Coast, and the other place is California, right?
Yeah, I was making the assumption that it was New York. I always do when I'm watching a
Okay.
movie and it's kind of like on the East Coast somewhere. Usually, I'm like, this is probably in New York somewhere.
Because
But it was a while before
yeah.
before they actually said New York. I was like, okay.
Yeah, before they said New York, I was like, they still could be in like the Chicago area.
Yeah, could have been Chicago.
Awesome.
But then they said that the sister was in Chicago, so I was like, okay.
But maybe they're in Detroit. I don't know. So
yeah. Yeah, it just like it turns out to be like, you know, some foreign country somewhere. Oh, okay.
I mean, they filmed "It's a Wonderful Life" in Encino, right, and pretended it was New York. So
they've been doing that. I didn't look up to see what those shooting locations for this. It looked like it was, you know, like the outside stuff was shot in New York, but yeah,
sometimes there are no
some
palm trees. So
yeah, that's when you can tell, right? The palm tree. But yeah, directors do that all the time. They call it, you know, in Halloween they're in Illinois, but they're shooting it in Pasadena, and so it's like palm trees everywhere. You're like, oh, this isn't Illinois.
Yeah.
But yeah, so any other scenes? I feel like we've touched on anything else, so we didn't touch on anything.
I think I think we covered. It's a very short movie, so
yeah, and that's another thing. I've been really surprised since I started this podcast. So many of these films from 1970 are 90 minutes. I thought that was more of a like I was sometimes I think like movies today are short, but then a lot of the big ones are really, really long. Like the big money maker, you know, Marvel movies, like 2.5 hours plus. you go back to the early 70s, a lot of these films, I think this film easily could have been a 2-hour movie. It might have been better for it. Might have given us a little bit more scenes between father and son, and maybe it developed a couple of the supporting female characters a bit more. Like,
Yeah, like
did you think 90 minutes was appropriate for this? I feel like this could have been a good 2-hour film.
yeah, I think like the fact that we see the mistress once never
Yeah.
comes up again.
Yeah.
We see, and then the fiance, she's super supportive of everything he does, and I'm like, does she know,
Yeah.
what's going on? So like, yeah, more could have been, because a lot of the female characters exist to bounce off of his indecision.
Mm-hmm.
They're not fully fleshed out, and in a 2020 like Netflix reboot,
which we'll talk about in a minute.
Yeah.
But yeah, I have no issue with, like, especially with a drama. Like, I will not question a drama when it's up to 2 hours. I don't, if it's a 2-hour story, it's a 2-hour story.
Right.
Comedies can be different. Sometimes when a comedy comes in at 2 hours, I'm like, but a story like this, I think 2 hours would have been fine. It's when it starts to creep up to 2.5. That's when I say, okay, have you earned this? Like, if you're gonna if I'm gonna watch a 2.5-hour movie, you have to earn it, right?
Because even so, this sounds like it was a pretty short play. If this was, I don't know if this is a 1-to-1 adaptation, but normally a play would be like there'd be an intermission and longer act.
A lot of films based on plays usually go to 2 hours or longer, right? They don't want to leave anything out. So I'd be curious to actually read the play and see, is it pretty much the same, or did they actually cut down on some things? I don't know. I would assume the play might be a little bit longer, because when you're usually translating a play to a film, you go a little bit shorter in the screenplay. But yeah, I'd be curious to know, like, was from the beginning, were they like, let's make this 90 minutes, like, let's make it short? Because there's
studio wants one thing.
The studio wants, I never sang for my father to play 5 times a day, not 4. This movie didn't do well, by the way. I don't even think it made $1 million at the box office, which is, I think it made like 800,000, which is not terrible.
What's the budget?
Gosh, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3. I don't think it made money. Yeah. So the Broadway show only played 124 performances, not a whole lot. I talked just recently on this podcast about The Great White Hope, and that was based on a play, and that had more than 500 performances. So that's kind of like a stark difference, 500 versus 100. So I don't know. I don't know. I feel like this is a time in cinema history where you could make a small drama based on a play that even the play wasn't super popular, get some good actors and get some Oscar nominations and go for it. I think it'd be really, really hard to make a movie like this today. And that takes us to my final question about the movie, which I ask of each guest, is, what was it like to look at this film through a 2020 lens, a movie released 50 years ago? Was there anything, you talked about the set design, anything about it that's like really dated, that dates the movie at all? And if they were to make this in 2020, the same story, like, how would it be different?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting because these types of issues are still a thing.
Oh, yeah.
So, instead of, I'm not sure what generation Melvyn Douglas's character would be a part of, but now it would be about like a baby boomer father, right?
Yeah.
And maybe Fox News is on all the time.
Fox News is playing in the background in every scene with the dad. That's what he's watching on the TV in the 2020 version. Not the what was he watching in the 1970 the westerns, right? So yeah, it'd be Fox News, and he'd be screaming at the TV.
Yeah, like I think you could still do a lot of the same things.
Yeah, I actually don't think a whole lot of this move. I don't think a lot of the story would change, right? Like the dialogue is pretty much. There wasn't a line of dialogue where I was like, "Ooh, I don't know what that's talking about." Like, it's it's a pretty modern story.
I need my BlackBerry moment.
Yeah,
so.
I feel like you'd have to modernize it. Like, you'd have to bring in some technology in the newer version. But yeah, in terms of like the performances, in terms of like the look of the film, I feel like it would be pretty similar. I forgot we never mentioned I loved the cover of Gene's short story collection at the beginning, when it's like the author's face, he's like, or whatever it is, like,
Yeah, it's
And
like that's his casting headshot that they just
yeah,
slapped on a
it's kind of like a
jacket.
mysterious. And I'm like, I don't think, I think that would have to change. Have you seen a short story collection by an author where their face is on it?
No, I
in
think
in the
he has a
last
different
10 years.
job now. I think now he works. He's in Silicon Valley,
Okay.
and he's a software engineer,
Okay.
and he's married a plastic surgeon
Okay.
in New
Or
York.
that's what he's going to do, right?
He's
Because
going
he
to marry a plastic surgeon, yeah. And
yeah.
I could imagine like almost like George Clooney from Michael Clayton in
Mm.
this kind of role.
Oh, okay.
Like more of the Descendants, like uh, sad George Clooney role.
So recasting the 2020 version, George Clooney for the son.
That's an option.
So he'd be older. How old is
Right.
George Clooney? Like 55?
Yeah. I'm saying George Clooney in 2008 would have been perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would love this movie to star George Clooney, 55-year-old George Clooney. Like, I want to move away, mom and dad, and go get married. And the dad's like, you can't leave us, son. I almost think Gene's, the character of Gene in the film was almost a little too old. Well, like, so he shot this when he was 38, 39. I felt like the character was supposed to
Yeah.
be what, more like 30,
But Gene Hackman is
32?
one of those actors who has always looked
Yeah.
older. His
Mhm.
face, it
Yeah.
just seems older, right?
But I
He's
felt
like
like
Tommy Lee
I
Jones.
felt like Gene should have been more like a 30-year-old, maybe even late 20s. I felt like
Right.
late 30s was almost too old for him.
To be
I don't
on
know.
he's going to start his second marriage.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
he couldn't be too young. He couldn't be 23 and my wife passed away and a few years ago and now I'm thinking about marrying again. Like so I do think he needs to be at least late 20s, early 30s, but I felt like maybe he was 10 years too old for this, but um
yeah, so
if this were done today, I feel
you
like
mean
they'd
you want
hire
Timothée
a young
Chalamet.
Timothée Chalamet would be Gene in the new version.
Someone not that young, but maybe like
Yeah, I think he's too young.
Miles Teller is still too young.
Miles Teller. Teller's 30, right?
Yeah,
Early
but
30s.
he looks young.
He looks. Who would play Tom? Gosh, I should have thought about this before. Ray Liotta. No, I don't know. An old gray Ray Liotta. Like watching his Fox News would be good.
Well, like, I think the one of the biggest movies recently that was about a father and a son being estranged was Ad Astra.
Oh, right. Tommy Lee Jones.
And Tommy Lee Jones, and Brad Pitt's obviously older.
Oh, you know who would be perfect to play the dad would be Brian Cox. He'd be perfect from Succession.
Yeah,
And
no,
he would be
I was
perfect.
thinking of that too.
I'll pitch it today. I'll pitch it this afternoon. Hey, have you guys seen this this old
You
Gene
want to
Hackman
play
movie?
King Lear again? Yeah.
We don't have to write a new script. We can just use the script. Do we have the rights? But yeah, I think more so than any film we've talked about on the podcast this far, I think this would be the easiest one to adapt to a modern film. I think you would just have to kind of add in some technology and, maybe add a few more scenes, maybe lengthen the ending a little bit. We didn't talk so much about exactly how the movie ends, and I don't want to give that away, but it's very abrupt, wouldn't you say? I was like, that's it?
It's rather sudden.
Yeah.
The curtains come down very quickly.
It cuts to a still image in the middle of a scene, and you're like, did my TV break? What's happening? And then, oh no, it's the end.
I wonder if that was like a thing in the film editing process where they're like, oh, maybe we need a bookends because it's abrupt on both
there's no
sides.
ending.
Yeah, like I think that may have been a problem they had after they had shot everything.
It's probably, if I had to guess, it's probably how the play ends, right? We probably have that final scene between them, and then it probably like somebody says over a microphone, and then blah 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 blah. It's probably how the play ends. So maybe they just kept it the same.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I didn't need another 30 minutes necessarily of, what the next 2 years look like, like them visiting and.
Well, we'll find out about Gene Hackman's failing marriage because of his mistress problem.
Yeah, something tells me that marriage isn't gonna stick. They seem to like each other, and they're like one scene.
Yeah.
Towards the end,
and she's like, I find your father so charming, right?
Yeah, but she even says to him, right? She's like, oh, we could move to you. I could take my kids and we'll move to New York for you. So she's like on board with this
He's really on
relationship.
board. Yeah.
Even though like he's just been staying around New York for way too long. She's
This
still like,
guy's a best-selling short story writer,
this
Brian.
guy, he teaches English, and isn't his dad at one point kind of make fun of that? First, the dad makes fun of the short story cover, right?
Yeah.
Which I think we can all, I mean, every writer can relate to that a little bit. To have, a lot of us have parents who are super supportive. Mine are very supportive of my writing, but they'll chime in with a negative here and there about a cover, or they'll read something new and they'll be like, well, you could have you could have done this. So I thought that was a great aspect of the mother character, was when he comes into her room, she's reading his book, which I thought was really great, right? Whereas the dad is watching television. So that tells you a lot about how each of them feel about his writing career and his teaching career. I think his dad kind of makes fun of the teaching too at one point. He's like, well, you're a teacher. What do you know? Or doesn't he say something like that? At some point that stood out to me.
Yeah. So there are plenty of microaggressions from
Yeah.
from Tom.
Yeah. But yeah, really strong film. I give it a solid like 7 out of 10, right? It's not like a 10 out of 10, like, oh my gosh, go find it. It's incredible. It's not a movie like that. But, if you like stories about family and fathers and sons, and if you like Gene Hackman at all, this is a great find. I've been a huge fan of Gene Hackman's ever since I was a kid. He was big in the 90s, right? He was in 1 to 2 movies every year in the 90s. I saw a few of them. Crimson Tide and Quick and the Dead and Enemy of the State, all these kind of like action-y movies that I saw when I was young. So he's been a big, kind of movie figure in my life for many, many years. And to see him do this kind of early role where he plays much more reserved, I thought was like, it was a great way to spend 90 minutes. I was very happy watching this film.
Yeah, I'd say I give it the same kind of rating. I would say it's like 3 out of 5.
You're like, I'd give it about the same, like 1.5 out of 7.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think the subject matter is really relevant and resonant, and something we don't always look for.
Yeah, like I watched the film recently for the podcast that was very much of its time for 1970, and I did not connect to it at all from a 2020 lens. But a movie like this can kind of exist in any decade, and it doesn't change a whole lot. And sometimes those are the kind of stories that we like to seek out, especially older films. When you're watching an older movie that you just have no connection to, you can't quite figure out why they made it in the first place or what's going on in terms of the plot. It's nice sometimes to find a film that could be made today and not a whole lot would be different. All right, cool. So that takes us to our final 2 segments. The first one is called the Divine Double Feature. This is where we pick a more contemporary film with a similar story or a tone or, family drama, something kind of similar to what's going on in I Never Sang for My Father. We talk about it, thinking of it as like a double feature. Like if someone were to watch I Never Sang for My Father, and they could do a double feature for this one because it's only 90 minutes long, what would be a kind of a contemporary film that would have some similarities to the first film, but also kind of show a little bit the evolution of cinema and how movies have changed over the last 50 years. So what did you go with?
Yeah, so my pick for a double feature would be with the 2010 Greek film Edinburgh.
I don't know this film.
Okay, well, that's cool. So it's directed by Athena Rachel Changari.
Okay.
And she is a frequent collaborator with Yorgos Lanthimos. And actually, this movie, I think it was in a few festivals, and Quentin Tarantino really liked it. So it does have some international renown.
Oh, cool.
And it's about a young woman in Greece, and she moves back in with her father, who is dying of cancer. And her father is an architect, and she's just kind of living with him in this small town in a very like remote part of Greece. And the town it's like a planned community that it looks like it's like a modern version of an ancient city, kind of. It looks like an island village, but it's very industrial. And this woman, she's hanging out with her best friend, and she's going on awkward dates with this guy in town who happens to be played by Yorgos Lanthimos. And it is this kind of dealing with aging kind of movie, very poignant and I think it goes really well.
Oh, cool. Is that the director of The Favorite you're talking about? Or is
Yeah,
that, am I thinking
Yorgos
of some?
Lanthimos,
Okay.
the favorite, the killing
And
of a
The
sacred
Killing of a
deer,
Sacred Deer.
Dogtooth.
And what was the other one? The Lobster?
The lobster is the
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, he's a great director. The Favorite was amazing. Amazing movie.
so
And I
this
didn't
this
know he was an
yeah,
actor. So he acted in this film?
he did.
Okay.
And this film, it shares some aspects of his movies, which are the characters kind of speak in a flat tone,
Mm-hmm.
which is a trademark of Lanthimos, but Chingari is doing that as well here.
Oh, cool. I'll have to
So
check that out. What, say the title one more time. What's it called?
it's called Attenberg, which is
Attenberg.
it's in reference to David Attenborough, the
Oh, okay.
the nature documentary person.
Okay.
But that's
Because when
like
you say that, I think Richard Attenborough from Jurassic Park and Gandhi fame.
no,
The
because they
brother, right?
the daughter and the father watch Attenborough nature documentaries
Okay,
together,
gotcha.
and I guess when that name got transliterated into Greek and then back into English, it gets shortened to Attenborough.
Oh, interesting. Okay, cool.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'll put that on my list. It sounds like a really great film. My choice is from 2007, starring Laura Linney and Philip Seymour Hoffman, from director Tamara Jenkins. The Savages. Have you seen this film or heard of
no,
it? The Savages is about a brother and sister finding out that their father basically needs to be in a retirement home. He's not doing well. And so it's like a whole movie of them just trying to find the right home for him and to find a good place that he'll be safe and secure. But the dad has dementia, and so it's kind of like a hard, it's kind of, it's like the only film I've seen where like the entire film is about like what happens when you have a mother or father who just can't take care of themselves anymore, and you have to find them a place to live. And he doesn't just stay in one place; he makes trouble at one of them, so they have to move him to a different one. But it's very much more of a black comedy than I Never Sang for My Father is. There are moments of humor in it. It's also very serious too, and there's this crazy good scene where Philip Seymour Hoffman stands outside of one of the homes they're looking at, and he just like lays into his sister, just like see all the pretty grounds here and the grass and this and that. It's all bullshit. It's like you can't even imagine the horror and the terror going on in that building. Blah 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 blah. And he like yells at her, and then and then he stops as someone's being like wheeled like across the parking lot, like this old lady like in a wheelchair. So it has these moments where you're like, it's like really dramatic and serious and captivates your attention, and then there'll be like kind of like a bit of humor. So a little bit like Alexander Payne's work, the director of Election and About Schmidt,
yeah,
where
yeah.
he takes on serious subject matter but does it with a little bit of humor. That's The Savages. It was on my top 10 list of 2007. I've seen it a couple times since. It's got two of my favorite actors in it, Laura Linney, Philip Seymour Hoffman, and they're great together. Great chemistry, brother and sister in the movie. And I felt like it played with a lot of similar themes of I Never Sang for My Father. And so that would have been 37 years later. So you can kind of see a similar story, created in two different time periods. I think that one would make a really good double feature. And I recommend The Savages to you. It's definitely worth a look.
Yeah, I will.
Cool. All right, our final segment is called Beyond the Flick, where we pick an actor or a director or genre affiliated with the movie, and we kind of talk about them a little bit and pick our three favorites. So we're going big on this one. We're going with Gene Hackman, as I said before, one of my all-time favorites. What's been kind of your history with him as an actor, and if you were able to pick two or three favorite films of his or roles that he's been. This is something that I talk about online sometimes. Kind of tricky, right? Because it's like, do you pick the three best movies they're in, or do you pick the three roles that best kind of like show their talent? They're kind of two different things. I try to kind of keep it somewhere in the middle. Whereas like their best movie is this one where they had 3 minutes of screen time. You don't want to do that. But a supporting role is totally fine. So what's been your experience with Gene Hackman?
Yeah, so like when I was thinking of these movies, I kind of wanted to pick three that showed different sides of his career.
Okay. Yeah.
The first one I picked, which you probably picked too, is like The Conversation.
Yeah, that's my number 3, The Conversation. Okay, cool. Yeah, it's not as well known as some of Francis Ford Coppola's other films of the 70s. People know Godfather and Godfather 2, but in between, he made The Conversation, which is a much smaller, quieter film. One of Gene Hackman's best performances. What do you think of The Conversation?
Yeah, I think it's an extraordinary like mystery movie,
Mm-hmm.
and the fact that Gene Hackman also plays a very quiet character in that
That's
movie.
right. You're right. He does. That is a more reserved character than he usually plays, for sure.
And yeah, I think I had read about it, you know, on the internet, and talking about how Gene Hackman had never played or didn't often play characters that quiet. So that
Mm-hmm.
was a new experience for him too. But that it's a great mystery. It's got Robert Duvall and John Cazale and Harrison Ford's in it. Like it's yeah, I don't know what
Oh, I
more I can
forgot
say.
about that. It's been a
Yeah,
while. It's Harrison Ford's in it. I forgot that.
yeah,
Just like a part, like a little part of it.
yeah. Kind of like how Harrison Ford has a little part in Apocalypse Now, right?
Oh, right. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, real quick, I actually saw Francis Ford Coppola at a restaurant in Napa Valley in 2010, and I went up to him and I thought, you know what, I'm gonna get his attention. I'm gonna say how great The Conversation is. And so I just, hi, Mr. Coppola. I just want to say I'm a big fan, and I just want to tell you, what a great film The Conversation is. I think it's, one of your best works. And he put his fork down and he looked at me, and then he went and then he went back to eating. He didn't even acknowledge me. I was like, oh, sorry. I don't usually approach
Right.
famous people at a restaurant, but I was like, this will be the one time I ever get to see Francis Ford Coppola in person. That didn't do it.
Yeah.
I think I needed to bring up an even more obscure film of his, like The Rain People from 1969.
Yeah, I think it depends on who you're approaching for that one.
I think directors, especially, they're like, take a hike. you know, Actors, they're used to it more so than director. But yeah, Conversation would be my number 3 as well. Great film. I've been meaning to watch it again. I'll be excited to look at it again for the podcast in a couple years here because it has been a long time. But yeah, I feel like it's the one that not enough people mention because he's so famous. Coppola is for The Godfather, at least the first 2 films that he made in the 70s, and the Conversation is just as compelling for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and then the second one I'd pick. I think you mentioned this one before, but Crimson Tide.
Okay. With
Because it does.
Denzel.
That's like the archetypal '90s role for Gene Hackman, where he's an authority.
Yeah, yelling and
He's like-
screaming.
He's the General MacArthur archetype of being like very extreme,
hmm
and Denzel Washington is playing the Gregory Peck Henry Fonda role, like being like I'm a reasonable person, and also or even more charismatic than Gene Hackman. So seeing them go toe to toe in what is an action movie, which has rogue submarines and nuclear problems, that's a lot of fun, I think.
Yeah, I don't know why that one. For some reason, I didn't see that in the theaters. I saw it later on video, so it doesn't have quite as much resonance for me as some of his other kind of '90s action movies. But yeah, really great pairing of him with Denzel, and yeah, absolutely. Like if you want to see like what's like a kind of a typical Hackman '90s performance and character, that's a really good one to take a look at.
And then the last one we mentioned the Royal Tenenbaums, but I think it's important as a movie, especially in conversation with I Never Sang for My Father, because in this one he plays the Melvyn Douglas character, basically.
Yeah, that's like kind of his last really great film and role is the Royal Tenenbaums. That's my number 2. So yeah, that's a great. That's might be my favorite Wes Anderson movie of all of them.
Yeah, and I know, like, I think if you look into it and read about the alleged problems on the set between Hackman and Wes Anderson,
I haven't looked into that. They had a kind of a struggle in their relationship on that set.
Yeah, Hackman did not get along with Anderson, and
Okay.
Wes Anderson had a very difficult time working with Hackman, apparently, allegedly. So it's interesting because most of the characters in that movie are playing the flat Wes Anderson style of the affect, but Gene Hackman is not. And even though the role was written for him, it seems like he was I'm just going to do my own thing. And I don't know what that does. I think it is one of the best Wes Anderson movies, but it is interesting when you look at it from the multiple levels of what was going on.
And one of Gene Hackman's most kind of unique performances. I mean, towards the end of his career, he was kind of phoning it in, right? Like a lot of his, you look at his last 10 movies he made, there's not a whole lot of variety in terms of the characters and performance, but the Royal Tenenbaums was kind of the last really unique original creation for him. And as you said, I did know that that role was written for Gene Hackman. And I believe he said, like, Gene Hackman, he didn't like that. He didn't like when roles were written for him specifically. He liked to come on board a project that he just responded to. But that one, thankfully, he took on just 2 years or 3 years before his retirement. After Royal Tenenbaums, he would just be in 2 more movies. The Runaway Jury, another kind of legal thriller, and Welcome to Mooseport with Ray Romano. We talked about this on the 5 Easy Pieces podcast episode of how it just bothers me when a really great legendary actor, when the final film is a piece of crap. Not to say, honestly, I haven't seen Welcome to Mooseport, so maybe it's good. I don't know, but it looked kind of pedestrian comedy movie. Came out in like February.
I watched the trailer the other day, and I was like,
it's probably fine.
So the premise is actually, pretty funny. So it could have been good, maybe.
It's just one of those things. It's like when you're such a legend like he is, like, I think back on like Henry Fonda, who had an amazing career, and his last movie is On Golden Pond, which might be his greatest performance in an amazing film. Like, it always makes me feel good when they go out with something really strong and not a clunker. Like at least Welcome to Mooseport didn't do so well at the box office. And then Jack Nicholson, who had one of my favorites, his last movie, How Do You Know, with Paul Rudd and Reese Witherspoon, and another one that he didn't go out on a great note with. But at the end of the day, you have someone like Gene Hackman and so many great roles. I have a long list of honorable mentions. Obviously, Bonnie and Clyde, which we talked about, The French Connection, which I'm excited to watch again for next year. Young Frankenstein, he plays like the old blind guy, so he's not really like, it's a great movie. He's not part of it that much, but he is in Young Frankenstein, one of my favorite comedies of the 1970s. Superman 1 and 2, not 4. Superman 4, The Quest for Peace is not not good, but the first 2 are really solid, and he's great in those as Lex Luthor.
Yeah, definitely better than our latest incarnation of Lex Luthor.
Oh yeah, I can't even keep up. There's so many of them, but it's definitely one of my favorites is Gene Hackman. And then Hoosiers from the '80s, really good basketball movie. Mississippi Burning, which is really solid, kind of drama thriller movie with Willem Dafoe. And Get Shorty, which also came out the same year as Crimson Tide, 1995. That one I did see in the theater, which I feel like Crimson Tide was probably more appropriate for a 10-year-old than Get Shorty. I was like, Dad, I want to see Get Shorty. John Travolta and Danny DeVito, a really good movie. And then The Birdcage from 1996. Have you seen The Birdcage? One of my favorites. I almost put it number 3, and I'm like, I'm not going to put it over The Conversation.
Well, I think what's interesting about The Birdcage and his role in it is that, I mean, I don't know if you've seen La Cage aux Folles, the French.
Yeah, I did many years later. I caught the original. Yeah,
and so the original has the character that becomes Gene Hackman, but I felt like the original, what it is missing is someone as charismatic as Gene Hackman in that role. And in The Birdcage, he's playing the Republican senator on the morality committee, whose partner has just died of a heart attack while sleeping with
a hooker, right?
With a prostitute. And there's a big scandal, and they're like, the only way we can fix this is if we have a big, nice wedding. But they don't realize that their daughter is engaged with the son of 2 men who own a nightclub.
two gay men, right? It's so funny. Like, the premise is so funny. And then when they get to the dinner scene,
right, yeah,
it's like, I'll never forget, I was 11, 12 years old when that came out. I saw it in the theater opening weekend. I saw it with my grandparents, who I don't even think they knew it was about a gay couple. I kind of maybe did before we saw it, but I'll never forget the roar of the laughter from the audience in that like 20 to 30 minute section when they actually start having dinner and there's just one problem after another, like that kind of just like that slapstick comedy, just boom, 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 never stops you don't even have time to breathe.
Right.
It's so funny.
The dramatic irony of this super conservative politician at that time, you know. Also, like, he really hits it off with Nathan Lane's character when
he's enamored by her. He's just like, oh,
drag.
she's just a great lady. And
So
then
that's
when his wife, played by Diane Wiest, who I also love, great character actress, walks up and this is a man. And he goes, what? And then you get Gene Hackman in drag at the end. I mean, what more do you want?
Right. So, and then, like, in that movie, he is playing the parody of his conservative authority characters. Like, it's if the little Bill from Unforgiven was in the 90s.
Yeah.
And then happened to also, like, wow, this man in drag is the perfect woman, you know?
Yeah. And that's a good segue. My favorite film of Gene Hackman's, if I had to pick one, even though it's a supporting role, it's the one he won an Oscar for, and it's Unforgiven by Clint Eastwood, which I saw for the first time in college. The editor of Unforgiven, Joel Cox, came and did a Q&A after the movie, and I got to see it like in 35 millimeter on the big screen. This would have been like 2004, 2005 in a giant theater on campus. And boy, that movie just blew me away. I've seen it 3 or 4 times since. Might be Clint Eastwood's greatest film. He obviously won director and producer for that movie. I'm not a big Western person. I talked recently on the podcast on the Monty Walsh episode. It's not my favorite genre, not by a long shot. But there's something about Unforgiven that almost doesn't even feel like a Western after a while. It's like just the themes of that film and the characters, and Gene Hackman plays one of his most just vile characters in that movie. He is just on a whole nother level of heinous in Unforgiven, and he's so good. He's so every time he's on screen in Unforgiven, you can't take your eyes off. So yeah, I think he's great in that film, and it's probably the best one that he's made in a long career of great movies.
Yeah, no, he's so menacing. When he beats up Richard Harris's character.
Oh yeah,
for the beginning, and Richard Harris is this gunslinger, right?
Yeah,
it's like, whoa, okay, this town isn't big enough for the two of you. Yeah. So.
And Hackman didn't, if I remember reading this correctly, he didn't want to do the movie. He didn't want to play a character like that, and it was Eastwood had to talk him into it. He was like, no, you're the guy for this. Come on. And so he finally, okay, and you know, won an Oscar for it. So it was a good career choice on his part for sure. So that kind of takes us to the end here. I want to thank you, Harrison, for joining me. Is there any last words you want to say about our film today, or about anything else? Anything you want to promote or tell our listeners where to find you online.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me, Brian. You know, I love talking about movies. And
yeah,
love, you know, finding the charming and sometimes, you know, dated things that have happened in older movies. So I think this podcast is a really great initiative, and I'm really happy to be a part of it. And
absolutely, I'd love to have you on again at some point. Lots of movies to come. So
yeah, you got to get through 50 years to get to 2020, and then you can reassess.
Film at 0.
Yeah, it's a countdown. So
because 2020 will be a short year. There's not many movies to talk about.
There was that Ethan Hawke movie where he plays Tesla, and I think that's kind of Mulan.
There's like seven films in 2020 to talk about. But yeah, I don't think we'll get to 2020. I think I'll be in my 80s, so I think at that point I will have called it good. But definitely want to stick it out at least for the 70s movies. So many great ones to talk about. So yeah, is there anywhere our listeners can find you online that you want to share with us, or
sure,
you want to promote?
I'm a writer involved in different fields. If you want to follow me or learn more about what I do, go to www.harrisonblackman.com.
All right. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again, Harrison, and thank all of you for joining us at Film at 50. Please give the podcast a 5-star rating and a review, and tell your friends and family about us. You can find the podcast on filmat50.com, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and you can email us at 50yearsagoinfilm@gmail.com. Also, take a look at the Patreon page, which has exclusive bonus episodes every month, at least 2 bonus episodes every month. So check that out and support the podcast. Until next time, remember, 50 never looked this good.